Hi, so today we'll be speaking to Millie Thomas, an eating disorder specialist. How are you, Millie?
I am great, thanks. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. So, to start us off, how would you describe your journey from a 16-year-old to where you are today, and how has your life influenced the profession you've gone into?
So for me, I had severe anorexia nervosa from the age of 12 to 27 years old. So I had had a perfectly idyllic childhood, never had any issues around body or food or anything like that until I started at a private all-girls school. And that's really where the scene was set for my eating disorder. And often when I talk about eating disorders, I say that the genes load the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. And for
Yeah,
me, starting at that private all girls school was really the trigger. And so I had all the personality characteristics that predisposed me to having an eating disorder, type A, high achiever, OCD, all of those sorts of things. And so for me, that's what triggered my eating disorder off. And when I started at the school, I became friends with somebody who, at the time, I didn't realize was very toxic and manipulative. And that for me made me just sort of feel a little bit uneasy and like I needed to somehow change myself to be better. And in my mind, I thought, well, if I lost some weight, that would be a really good thing. And so I started innocently sort of eating healthier. But once my weight went below a certain point, that is when my eating disorder was triggered off. And unfortunately, at that point in time, and what is still often seen as what you should do is put on the weight. So I got
yeah,
taken out of school and I did family-based therapy and put the weight on and she'll be fine. But unfortunately, you can put weight on somebody, but unless you help them to deal with the cognitive stuff that's happening behind the scenes, that the neural pathways and helping them to create new ones, then that person is still going to be left with all those eating disorder thoughts. So for me, everybody thought I was better. I got put back in school and I felt like I had to pretend. So I went back to school and I threw myself into academia
yeah,
and, topped all my classes and all those sorts of things. Meanwhile, never really living a full life. It was an existence. I didn't go to parties. I wasn't a normal teenager in that respect because I would have to worry about the food that was served. And I certainly didn't want to drink alcohol because I would,
yeah.
lose control. And so I did my whole high school years. And then in my last year, year 13 in New Zealand is the last year of school. And I got invited to go to the Global Young Leaders Conference in Washington and New
Oh
York.
wow.
And that for me was a huge honor. It was individuals that have been selected from each country around the world as representatives. And we went to the United Nations and all sorts of incredible things. And so there was no way in my mind that I wasn't going to take up that opportunity. However, it was the first time since getting unwell at the age of 12, so now I was 18, that I had been away from my parents. And so I got on that plane and my eating disorder just dug its claws in and was like, well, no one knows. This is a perfect opportunity. You can just not eat and
Yeah,
lose weight. And so I became very unwell on that trip. Made it home. At the time, didn't really realize how bad things were getting. Made it home, and my mum just was devastated to see how much weight I had lost on the trip. But to me, I was like, well, I'm 18 now. You can't force me to do anything. And so I got this scholarship, academic scholarship to university, and I wanted to go to university and do my business degree. And, life was fine. Like I was fine. I'd convinced myself
yeah,
that it was all going to be okay. Um, Julie went to university, topped the business school, doing all of these things, never stopping to acknowledge the things that I was achieving because it was never good enough. In the eyes of the eating disorder, I could always do better. So it was just this drive in me. And that's what kept me from really realizing that, underneath it all, I didn't have a life. It was just this perfectionism and this high achieving mentality that I channeled myself into, which allowed me to stop thinking about my hunger and the fact that I wasn't having relationships or anything like that because the eating disorder was getting in the way. And long story short, my eating disorder got worse and worse. Was given I was headhunted for a job whilst I was still in university. So Julie went and did that. And basically it got to a point where, I was so unwell that I couldn't work anymore
yeah,
because of my health. And basically I was being seen as an outpatient at the hospital, and one day they just pulled me into a room and said to me and my parents that there is no hope for you. You're one of the worst cases we've ever seen, and you need to be put into palliative care. And, for me, that was, I had really been trying to recover so hard. Yes, I wasn't really making much progress, but I've been trying because I held on to that hope that one day maybe I could recover. And that day I felt like all my hope had been taken away from me. And so unfortunately for me, that then led me on a path of destruction. And I, got to basically rock bottom, where I walked into my GP. So I don't know if you in South Africa have GP, general practitioner, doctor. Yep. Yes. And so walked into my doctor's office, and he just said, you've got a week, maybe two to live, and you have to decide whether you're going to live or whether you're going to die. And for me at that point, and I want to be very clear, I have never been suicidal. I've never been depressed. Yep. But at that point, my eating disorder had such a grip. After 15 years, I felt I could feel my body eating itself from the inside out. I was permanently cold. Was riddled with stress fractures. My life was not a life. And I just couldn't bear the thought of waking up another day, having to live this miserable existence. And so I said, look, I think I am going to say that I'd rather just, leave things here. And I went home to my mum, and I told her, and she obviously was very upsetting for her to hear that I felt like I couldn't keep fighting. But she said to me, she didn't want me to die in Auckland because she knew I wasn't happy there. So that's where I was originally from, Auckland, New Zealand. And Noosa on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia had always been my happy place. So she brought me to Queensland, pretty much to have my final days. But she managed to find this woman who specializes in NLP, so neurolinguistic programming, and hypnotherapy. And that was transformational for me. My therapist, Silky, helped me to see my eating disorder in a completely different way. And, it was a huge process, the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And it pushed me to the absolute brink, and I was petrified beyond belief. But, long story short, in 6 months, I weight restored, I heart restored, which is, one of the most important things out of the whole process as well. And I was able to go back to New Zealand, and I quickly realized that that's not where I wanted to live my life. And I spent some time in California just finding myself and being independent finally, after so many years of being dependent on medical professionals and my parents. And I had this pivotal moment when I was over there, where I was journaling in a park, and I heard a woman pushing a girl on a swing. And she said to her, I'm not going to be able to swing you anymore soon because you're getting too fat. And I had this visceral reaction in the pit of my stomach to her saying that to that young girl. And people have been saying to me I should write about my story. And I'd never really felt like I had something unique to offer. But that night I went home and I wrote, and back then, it was 2015, you would write massive things on your Facebook wall. It was sort of a normal thing to do. Nowadays, you sort of don't do that. But I wrote this spiel about the raw reality of living with anorexia. And I went to bed, and then I woke up, and hundreds of people had liked it, and Huffington Post wanted to publish it. And then that began this sort of, I started to realize the more media interest that there was around it, and the way that it resonated with people, and all these people I'd gone to school with emerged out of the woodwork saying, well, I've been struggling for years, or parents of my friends telling me that they'd been struggling. And that's when I realized this is my purpose. There is a reason that I struggled so long and so hard, is to prove to people that you can fully recover and to use my story to help others. So I decided I was going to move to my happy place on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. And I had a dream of starting an eating disorders charity. And within a couple of weeks of moving there, I was introduced to this amazing couple, Mark and Gay Forbes, who had started an amazing charity called End Ed. And I approached them, and we were very aligned in our vision, values, and goals. And so we combined. They'd started it as a parent support group, and I said I would like to help people who are actually in the depths of it themselves. And so that's how it began. And we had the combined goal of establishing Australia's first residential eating disorders facility, and that is now fully established and running. And So I've also established my private practice as well. I no longer work for Indeed, but I've got my private practice Healed, where I do eating disorder recovery coaching, and I am a neurolinguistic programming practitioner as well. And it's something that I am so passionate about. I love, and it's funny, you go through something in life that brings you literally to the point of having to come face to face with your reality. Sorry, having to come face to face with your mortality.
Yeah.
And it's in those moments where it's almost like a moment of reckoning, right? And that's where you really, really find your true strength. And I always say to people, yes, 15 years of my life with this beast of an illness, and that's what it is. It's this insidious beast of an illness. But it has given me my purpose in life, and it has now given me the life that I have now. And I know myself in more depth, more intimately than I possibly could if I hadn't gone through that, because I was forced to learn how to use my personality characteristics for good, rather than for getting me further into an eating disorder. So I'm very grateful for my journey, and yeah, it has gotten me to where I am today.
Yeah. So that's obviously a lot to process. I mean, you've given me a full breakdown of where you were as a child and everything. I'm going to break it down to smaller parts. I'm going to go back to the start of your answer where you were in a girls' school, and then we'll come back later in the interview of how you solve this and how people what it actually is. I mean, I don't really have a good understanding of what it feels like in your head of what an eating disorder is. So I'll get to that later. But first, you mentioned that you were at a girls' school. What problems did you see in that girls' school that actually almost encourages eating disorder or yeah?
Very much comparison. So that feeling of needing to fit in, being one of the cool crowd.
Yep.
And in my mind, I saw the cool girls or the popular girls as being also the thin girls. Now,
Yep.
of course, that wasn't necessarily the case. There were other girls there that weren't necessarily what somebody would have deemed thin, okay? But my mind had honed in on the ones that were, and had said, the voices had already started. Those eating disorder little voices or self-doubt voices or whatever you want to call them had started. And so that little voice in my head just saying to me, well, if you were more like them, then the boys would like you more,
Yeah.
or you'd be more successful, or you'd be happier.
Yeah. I mean, I completely disagree with that sort of stereotype of the boys will like you more if you this. How can a female who's dealing with this sort of stuff, or a human being for that matter, deal with that sort of stereotype of going around thinking that that's actually not the truth?
I think we're very, very lucky now that we've got much more body diversity going on. So
Yep.
I think that's amazing. We've still got a long way to go, but as a society, we are embracing the fact that we're all so unique and so different, and that, everybody perceives beauty in a different way. And being yourself is the most beautiful thing of all. We're all genetically different,
Yep.
and we need to embrace that. And I think surrounding yourself with people who embody that, people who live their lives and are unashamedly themselves, and they embrace that, rather than people who are always worried about what other people are thinking or are trying to make themselves something that doesn't come naturally to them. I think that's a huge thing, because I think who you surround yourself with, then, I mean, it has much more of an influence than we realize.
Yeah. And then, first of all, by listening to you, I truly think that you're an inspiration. How you've almost overcome all this sort of thing. It's really, really powerful and strong. I just want to say that before I continue here. And then I just want to get a vague understanding, because, I mean, I'm not sure the answer to this question. What does it actually feel like in your head to have an eating disorder that's that severe? I mean, what actually goes through your mind?
So it's torture. So it's like 24/7 torture. And when I say 24/7, I mean that. So even in my sleep, I was either being tortured in my dreams by this eating disorder that was telling me that I shouldn't have eaten this, or I should have, done this amount of exercise, or whatever it is. Or every waking minute is a calculation, or you haven't done this right, or, well, you're never in the moment. you're always living in your head and you're never able to be present because your head is always just spinning and spinning and spinning, whether it be about food, whether about exercise, whether about some little comment that someone in the supermarket made that you don't even know, but that you've somehow twisted around in your head to, be convinced that that means that that person thought you'd gained weight. It doesn't make sense. It's not logical, but it feels completely logical. It feels like the most logical thing in the world. And by playing by your eating disorder's rules, that somehow you're going to achieve this eternal happiness. And so therefore, my eating disorder would say to me, well, if you just do what I say, then you're going to be happy for the rest of your life and never have to worry about a thing. And for me, I thought, well, that makes total sense. So I just need to lose this little bit of weight, or I just need to do this particular thing, and therefore I will be happy.
Yeah.
The world is very black and white. There's no, when I think about it metaphorically, it's like I was trudging through this black and white world with this huge bag of bricks on my shoulders, feeling the weight of the world, thinking that everyone was out to get me, everyone was looking at me. And, when I emerged on the other side of that eating disorder, it literally, and I say this, Ben, in all seriousness, it was like the world just suddenly opened up before my eyes. Everything was in like color, and I could notice things that I'd never even noticed before, because when you're in your eating disorder, it's this tunnel vision and you just cannot for the life of you see the world around you, because you just are so hyper focused on your body and food and people's opinions of you and achieving this idea of perfection. So it is literally this torturous living hell. And no matter how much physically you were hurting, no matter how much hunger you were experiencing, the mental drive to ignore that is just so strong that you can just keep going, and then you just sort of running on this adrenaline and this euphoric feeling that you get from restriction.
Yeah. So you mentioned perfection, and I'm a true believer that perfection almost doesn't exist, especially with humans, and that's almost what makes us all so great, is that we're all different. As you mentioned earlier, we're all different and perfect in our own ways when it comes to our bodies and all that sort of stuff. How can someone dealing with this sort of perfection thing come over this and almost get out of that habit of eating too little, or how can someone almost recover and release themselves from this trap of the eating disorder?
So what's really interesting is the very personality characteristics that got me into the depths of my eating disorder are the very personality characteristics that got me out.
Yep.
So my perfectionism, well, I was using that to fuel my eating disorder. I wanted to be the best, eating disorder sufferer. I don't like to use the word anorexic because I think it labels the person as the eating disorder. Someone has anorexia. So I want to be the best person I could possibly be with anorexia. I wanted to show them how perfectly it could be done. And then when I realized that these things like my stubbornness, my vehement stubbornness to stick with my eating disorder could be turned around and used as determination in recovery, or like, right, I'm going to absolutely nail recovery. It's going to be almost like a university assignment, right? And I am going to get an A+. And so I think it's about learning that, okay, you have this side of our personalities, but how do we harness that in our lives in a positive way? I also think that it's important to recognize, as you say, that there is no such thing as perfection, because at the end of the day, that is somebody's opinion or perspective, right?
100%.
It's not a true thing. Everybody's idea of what is perfection is different. And I think also to remember that if you're going to spend your life striving for perfection constantly, you're actually missing out on life in the process, because the beauty and the imperfect nature of the life that we live in, there is so much beauty in that, and there's so much to be learnt from that. Yep. And I think, embracing that is so important.
And is there any advice you would give to those who are struggling with the eating disorder now? I mean, what would you tell them regarding overcoming it?
I am a huge believer that full recovery is possible.
Yep.
So for those of you out there who are struggling, who have been told, well, you'll just have to learn to manage your eating disorder. You'll never fully get over it, but you'll get to a point where you can learn to manage it. Or the voices will never totally go away. That is not true. You can fully recover from your eating disorder. No matter how long or how hard your journey has been, you can absolutely do it. Yes, it is hard. Yes, it will push you to places that you probably didn't ever thought you would go to. It'll push you, it'll make you realize that you're stronger than you ever thought you would be. It is, such a beast of a thing. But what I can promise you is that the battle is worth it. And one of the things to know is that it will feel like it's getting worse before it gets better. So don't let that stop you. Don't let that be a glass ceiling that you rebound off because you think, well, everyone said it was going to get easier and it's actually getting harder. It'll get harder because the eating disorder will get stronger and not want you to recover. But that's where you must push through and must keep going, because that's where you'll get to the other side. And, I've been working in this field now for 7 years, and I have never met anyone who has recovered who's regretted it. Nobody says, oh no, I wish I'd never done this. It's just not worth it. Life on the other side of an eating disorder is absolutely amazing and so worth every moment of that fight. I think one of the other things I would say is it takes a village. So you need to reach out. You need to get an amazing team around you of people who can help you on this journey. Don't think that you can do it alone, and don't feel like you have to. Don't feel like you have to be strong enough to do it on your own, because it will take a village for you to get to the other side. And don't be afraid of reaching out, and know that even if the eating disorder is telling you you're not sick enough and it's not really that bad, if your relationship with food or your body or exercise is preventing you from living a full life, then it is absolutely bad enough for you to reach out for help. Don't compare yourself to anyone else. If you're thinking about the fact you need help, then you must reach out.
So you mentioned reaching out to a village, and I'm going to come back to that analogy in like a few minutes, but I'm going to go back to you mentioned the word management. What strategies have you seen that have been most successful in trying to manage this eating disorder?
So what, in what way? What do you mean?
So like obviously managing your mind and managing what you do and how you eat and all that sort of stuff plays a role in the eating disorder. How can you go about managing the food, or what strategies have you seen that have been most successful in trying to overcome the eating disorder?
So more in terms of like recovery strategies, is that what you mean?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Right. Okay. So, personally for me as a coach, some of my top strategies are getting really, really clear on what you're fighting for. So what matters to you? What are the reasons that you're fighting? Because every single day when you get up and you have to come face to face with this eating disorder, you need to have a big list, whether it's a vision board, a list form, whatever it is, that reminds you of why you're fighting so hard. The big things, the little things that lie on the other side of fighting for your freedom. The other thing is to be very, very clear on your values. Get clear on, when we have an eating disorder, there's the eating disorder self there, and then there's the healthy self there. So what are your values? The healthy self, what are your values versus what are your eating disorder's values? So that you can clearly see that those two values are opposing, right? Yeah. And so every time where you're struggling to make a decision of whether to eat a meal or a snack or engage in whatever eating disorder behavior that it is, being really mindful of, if I do that behavior right now, is that in line with my values? Or is it in line with my eating disorder's values? Because one of the things I always say to people is, you might think one small decision in a day isn't going to make any, difference or impact, but it does. Every moment of every day, you have a choice point. And, I look at it like, often I use the analogy of two bonfires, right? Are you throwing logs on the bonfire of your eating disorder? Or are you throwing logs on the bonfire of your healthy self? Every decision counts. And I think, I always say to people, I have this thing called Millie's 3 C's: conscious, consistent, commitment, right? And what you have to understand is your eating disorder is consciously, consistently committed to ruining your life. The modus operandi of an eating disorder is to end your life. So you've got to be consciously, consistently committed to recovery every moment of every day. And it honestly feels like a full-time job, but it's so important that you keep going. And
sorry, please continue.
I was just going to also say that what is really important to recognize is that you can't leave any stone unturned. So you've got to be honest with yourself, and you can't hold on to any single part of your eating disorder, because it's like you've got to slam the door on the eating disorder's face, throw away the key, because even if it's got one little behavior left, you can be sure you're leaving that little door ajar, and it will come creeping back in when you're in vulnerable moments. And so in order to achieve full recovery, you've got to lay yourself bare and really be honest with yourself about every behavior that is affecting you, so that you can get rid of them all and move on with your life.
Yeah. And how important is it for teenagers to speak out to their loved ones about the issue? I mean, is that almost crucial to overcoming it?
It is absolutely crucial. Okay, so isolation is like putting an oxygen mask on your eating disorder. Okay, connection is where it's at. Connection is so important. The moment you reach out and you connect, and that's one of the powerful things about coaching, right? Is my clients can reach out to me any time of the day. They've got that point of connection that then sets them back on the right track when their eating disorder is trying to convince them of things that are just so wrong and are going to send them in the wrong direction. And so it's really, really important that you have got support and people that you're reaching out to, because the moment that you reach out, that weakens the eating disorder. When you're on your own and those voices are really loud and the eating disorder is just bullying you into submission and trying to get you to do what it wants to do, the best thing that you can do is reach out for help. And even if you can't articulate what's going on, just by reaching out in that moment, you are still strengthening your healthy self, because that can take so much courage just to reach out.
And who would you recommend these people do reach out to?
So reaching out to loved ones, reaching out to anybody that you trust and letting them know what's happening. Obviously, when we look at recovery from an eating disorder, having a multidisciplinary team of professionals around you, we definitely see that's where people have the highest chance of recovery success. Yep. So having a wonderful GP who definitely is trained in eating disorders. I mean, this is in an ideal world.
Yeah.
Having an eating disorder trained GP and a psychologist, a dietitian, and a psychiatrist is often really helpful as well. Having a recovery coach is a total bonus too. And so having that team of professionals around you to help you. And it's also really important that all those professionals communicate. It's really essential, because the eating disorder has a way of splitting teams and telling one professional one thing and one professional another thing. Yeah. So that is really, really crucial as well.
And that's obviously in an ideal world. For someone who doesn't have the opportunity to go to a professional, how should they approach their friends or their family regarding the thing? How should they start off that conversation regarding the fact that they have an eating disorder?
Honest. Be open, Be real. You know, people that love and care about you are not going to judge you. They're going to want to be there. And though they might not completely understand it, but reaching out is the first step. And I mean, I would also encourage you to, I did a wonderful podcast with NDED called End Eating Disorders. And so, you know, you could direct them to the podcast where we unpack so much of what eating disorders are and talk to many different, not only experts, but also people who have lived experience, and they talk about their journeys. We talk to parents, things like that will help give your loved ones an insight into what's going on inside.
Yep. And is there a difference in eating disorders with girls and guys? I mean, is there a different feeling? Have you done studies on that in terms of different genders and how it affects guys and girls?
The reality of it is an eating disorder affects everybody differently.
Yep.
So what I always say is that eating disorders tailor themselves to the individual, and therefore our treatments need to be tailored to the individual as well. Eating disorders are constantly morphing and changing. So it's not necessarily that they affect females and males differently. The the fact is they affect everybody differently. Yes, there are commonalities throughout, but the eating disorder affects somebody differently depending on their personality characteristics, depending on their social situation. I mean, when we talk about eating disorders as being a biopsychosocial illness, there are so many different elements to it. And so it's a complicated beast of a thing to treat because of that, and because of the fact that it does tackle everyone so individually.
Yeah. So I'm going to change the topic more towards social media, because it's a very hot topic in the world at the moment. How has social media influenced the body image or eating disorder issue in the world?
Hugely.
Yeah.
I always say to people, like, back when I was 12, we didn't have social media. And I'm really, really grateful that we didn't, because I don't know if I would have survived if we'd had social media. At that point in time, I had to go to the newsagent and look at the magazines and compare myself to the models at that stage.
Yeah.
Now you've got it in the palm of your hand. I think it is one of the hardest aspects for people struggling with eating disorders to navigate. The comparison is just rife, but also what we see on social media is people out there pretending to be experts in things that they're not experts in. People who pretend to know everything about nutrition and personal training and things like that. And people are looking at those images and that advice and thinking, well, if I just follow this advice, I'll look like this.
Yeah.
Little do they know that advice actually has no, clinical backing. And also that everybody is unique and different. So just because someone else has done that particular exercise regime or has eaten that particular type of food doesn't mean that you're suddenly going to end up like them. And I think, one of the most toxic things out there is the what I eat in a day. You shouldn't be comparing. Everybody's needs are different. And, it's we how boring would the world be if we all went around looking like clones of one another and we're exactly the same? Like, that's the beauty of being human, is that we're all different. And so we have to move away from constantly being on social media and comparing ourselves. Now, there are some real positives of social media. There's some amazing recovery accounts. There's lots of inspiration out there. But what I always do with my clients is do a social media cleanse. So get them to look at the people that they're following. Now, if there's anyone that they're following that they feel that they're comparing themselves to or feel inadequate when they look at their posts, then they need to stop following them. So it's about filling your feed with things that inspire you. Also, a lot of the time for people in eating disorder recovery, it's about getting rid of all the food, exercise content, and filling your feed with things that are on your what am I fighting for list. For me, it was nature and places I wanted to travel to, and poetry and interior design. Make your feed full of things that feed your soul, not feed your eating disorder.
100%. So I'm going to go back to your personal journey, and a general theme on the podcast is success, and happiness to a large part is success, which is why I think focusing on these social issues regarding eating disorders and mental health is very important. What is your personal definition of success?
Wow, that's such a good question. It's a really good question. You know what? It's not one that I've ever thought about before. For me, success is living a life of freedom, one where I wake up each day and know that I'm truly living my purpose, and that I feel happy and fulfilled within my mind, body, and soul.
And have you achieved that? I mean, what's the next step in your journey to try go forward?
Truly do believe that I have achieved that. It's been a hard-won battle to have the life that I now have, but I do feel very lucky that I mean, we can always improve. I will always have more goals, and I will always have more things that I want to achieve, absolutely. But when I wake up every morning, I do know that I'm living my purpose, and I'm grateful, and I do feel happy in my mind, body, and soul. And so for me, that is success. But that doesn't mean that I am settling. for what I have now, and don't have goals, as I say, and things that I want to achieve. And for me, I want to, when I leave this earth, know that I've had the biggest impact that I can have on as many people as I can. And I want to touch as many lives as I can. So that's what drives me every day to get up and keep going and figure out ways that I can help people to achieve their own freedom.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, and I really appreciate the interview. I mean, you're a true inspiration to me and a lot of other teenagers in the world. I mean, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure.
Thank you for listening to that episode of Graded Podcast. That was Millie Thomas on eating disorders. Looking forward to seeing you in the next one. Cheers.